Hello, everybody. Okay, it's nice to see we have a solid sized crowd in attendance today. All right, so thank you guys for attending. My name is Ahmed. I'm a senior full stack engineer at Dgraph. I'm going to be your host today. Joining me today is Zenny, Phoebe, and Evelyn. They're going to be the moderators. They're going to make sure that your questions get answered. Speaking of questions, all the questions are going to be answered in the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. Make sure to post any questions you have in the Q&A, and we'll get them answered for you. Also, if you feel like I'm going too fast, you want to see something again, etc., this whole webinar is going to be recorded. You're going to get the video in your email, and you're going to get a Git repo with everything you need to pretty much replicate what we're doing here. All right, so let's get started. So I'm sure most of you guys will agree with me when I say that authentication and authorization are hard and complex topics, right? And GraphQL actually makes them a bit harder because you can't, at least it's not recommended to include your business logic in the GraphQL layer. So you need to have a separate layer to handle all of the business logic. But it doesn't have to be this complex. Using Dgraph and Auth0, we're actually going to add auth to a GraphQL app in about 15 minutes, and we're not going to spin up another server to do so. So what are you going to learn today? So number one, we're going to set up Dgraph. We're going to be using Dgraph as our GraphQL server and our database. So we're going to need to know how to set that up. I'm going to give you a high-level overview of the Dgraph auth flow. I'm going to show you how to add auth to an existing schema, which is a to-do app built with React. It's included in the repo that you can see in the bottom right. That repo includes the to-do app, React. It includes everything you need to do to get Auth0 working with Dgraph. And it'll also include the finished product after we finish this webinar. All right, after that, we're gonna set up Auth0. This is gonna take a couple of minutes. And then we're gonna connect Auth0 both to Dgraph and to the front end. So we're hoping all of this is gonna be done within 20 minutes. Without the talking, you could probably finish all of this in under 10 minutes. So we're going to be doing all of this live just to show you how simple it is. So some basic terminology, just so you know what I'm talking about when I refer to authentication, authorization. So authentication is verifying that a user is who they say they are. So an authentication service will take some sort of details, usually an email or a password, or maybe a Google account, and verify that you are who you say you are. Authorization is, now that you're a verified user, what actions are you allowed to take? Either based on records that are yours or your role. So in our to-do example, our authorization will be to lock down the to-dos so that only you can see them. So you can only see your to-dos, and I can see my to-dos, but I can't see your to-dos, for example. And the last terminology that we're going to talk about today is JWTs. So a JWT, as I'm sure most of you know, is just a token with a JSON payload. It's used to pass identity and information between the authentication service and the authorization layer. All right, so like I said earlier, we're going to be using Dgraph. So what is Dgraph, for those of you who have never heard of it? Dgraph is actually a native GraphQL database, probably the first of its kind. And some of the benefits that Dgraph will give us in this project is extreme simplicity. So you only need to set up a schema. You don't need to set up resolvers or anything, and Dgraph will give you CRUD endpoints out of the box. So for example, the to-do app up to this point has taken us about 10-15 minutes to build. It'll also result in a lighter code base because we don't need to handle authorization. It's already built into Dgraph. And it works in the whole serverless model. Our front end is going to directly talk to our database and is going to directly talk to Auth0 with no API server in between. All right, now that we know what Dgraph is, how do we get started with Dgraph? So the fastest way to get started with Dgraph is like using a /GraphQL account. So you can get a /GraphQL account by going to dgraph.io//GraphQL. /GraphQL is Dgraph's managed GraphQL backend service. It lets you spin up a GraphQL server in a couple of minutes, as I'll show you right now, and it's completely free forever, and you don't need a credit card to get started. So I'm going to switch to my /GraphQL account. So once you sign up for an account, you'll be able to create a backend, and that's what we're going to do right now. Okay, we'll give it a name. We'll use the default selections. And we will, once that's done, we're going to use the schema. So just a quick explanation of what this schema is. So this is a to-do app schema. This is included in the Git repo. It has a user, it has a to-do. User has a username, which is your email, which you're going to sign up with Auth0. And the to-do is just a simple to-do, and it has a user. So we know to who it belongs to, right? So let's go ahead and apply this to, so let's get rid of this schema. And let's copy the to-do. All right, so now I've applied the schema. So I actually have the React frontend already working. What we're going to do is we're going to quickly connect this React frontend by going to the dashboard, grabbing the GraphQL endpoint, and then in the index.js, there's a big GraphQL endpoint constant. We'll just replace that. Now, and let's just quickly get rid of all the tasks. So we can start with a completely fresh example. Include all the users. Okay. So we'll refresh. We'll see that there's nothing here. We'll add a couple of example to-dos, like get the groceries. For example, make dinner. Yeah, so you can see that we can add to-dos. We can complete them. We can even delete them if we want. But there is a big problem here. And to show you this problem, I'm going to add some data into our database. So there's 3 other users that want to use this to-do app with me, right? So we have this very driven programmer. He wants to create a database, write a schema, put data in, get his app up and running. Very driven. He's put them on his to-do app. He's ready to go, right? There's also this other guy called Frodo. He wants to walk a bit. Maybe he wants to get in shape. I don't know. And he wants to discard some jewelry, right? And there's another guy called Skywalker. He wants to meet his dad, dismantle the empire, whatever, to each his own. So we're going to add these. And you can see that we're creating the user inline. And Dgraph is actually smart enough to understand that if all these users share the same username, then they're the same user. So we'll go ahead and add these in, right? And you can see we've added 10 new tasks with a bunch of new users. So let's refresh our to-do app. Now you can see that my to-do app has been messed up. I don't want to do all this stuff. I only wanted to get groceries and make dinner, right? These are not my tasks. And the other people are confused as well. Maybe the driven programmer, now by accident, he started walking, started discarding jewelry. Skywalker started programming by accident. And the programmer, he's trying to meet his dad for some reason, right? So obviously we need to get this fixed out so we can actually get stuff done and we can each see our own to-dos. Now to do that, I need to explain the overall Dgraph auth flow very quickly. It's extremely simple. So there's 3 main components. There's the front end, there's an authentication service, which can be anything, can be your own custom authentication service. We're going to use Auth0 for simplicity, but it can be anything that creates a JWT. And we're going to have Dgraph as our GraphQL server, which handles authorization. All right, so how the flow works is I go onto the front end. I get sent to the login page because I haven't logged in yet, right? The authentication service logs me in and then returns a JWT that has a custom claims with who I am, right? It'll include my email in this example. The front end now has this JWT, and it will send a query with this JWT to Dgraph. So for example, it's asking for the tasks. It'll include this JWT as a header. Dgraph will grab this JWT from the header, check if it's a valid JWT, audience, expiration date, for example. And then it'll check, based on the auth rules that we're going to define on the schema, if this action is actually authorized. And then finally, after all of that is done, based on the auth rules, it pulls specific to-dos. It'll return them to the front end, right? So as you can see, there's no API server. It's very straightforward, very lean. All right, so how do we actually go about adding auth to our schema? It's actually pretty simple. There's two separate parts. There is a comment that you add at the end of your schema. And this comment includes the verification key, which is, in our case, the public key, right? So we can verify that this token is actually from Auth0. The header. And the header is just what you're going to be passing the JWT on. So I'm going to use X auth token as a header. You can use authorization. You can call it whatever you want, right? The algorithm, the namespace first. And this is the namespace that our claims are going to be in. This will make more sense once I show you how I'm actually injecting into the JWT. But the namespace is pretty much a field that has an object of fields that we can use for authorization. The algorithm, this is the algorithm of the verification key, and any audiences we're going to use. We're going to be using Auth0's audience that it gives us. So this might seem like a lot. It will make a bit more sense once we actually add it to the schema ourselves. The second part is an auth directive that lets you define rules based on actions. So this auth directive, for example, we're defining a rule on query, right? And then in our rule, we actually query the database. So we pull the user, the capital USER, yes, it's actually all caps, from the JWT. We query the to-dos, and we grab any to-do that has a user that matches the username that we've passed in. So this effectively locks down all the to-dos to only limit it to to-dos that have our username. So we can only see our to-dos in essence. Okay, so that's a lot of theory, but how do we do this in practice? So the first step is we're going to need to actually create an Auth0 account extremely quickly. I already have one created. This is a completely empty account. So we're doing this from scratch. We're going to go to the applications. We're going to create an application. And we want a single web page application, right? Because Auth0 is going to interface with our front end. All right. So we're going to create that application. The next thing we're going to do, we need to get the public key. So Auth0 doesn't show you the public key, but you can download the private key. If you go to the settings, let me show you again. So you go to settings. In the new app that we created, you scroll down to show advanced settings, click on certificates, and then download the certificate as a PEM file. All right. Once you do that, then we can actually go about making the public key. So what we'll do is I've already downloaded the certificate. I'm going to pull up a command line, and I'm going to use OpenSSL to actually pull this to actually generate a public key for me. So my downloaded file is called webinarauth.pem. I enter this command, and this is included on the Git repo. Don't worry too much about reading it from here. You can just copy it from there. And now we have a public key. So there is one more step for us to get a working public key. And that is, you open up some sort of notepad program, anything that can edit like text. All we're going to need to do is get rid of the new lines. So Dgraph expects this public key on one line, and it expects the new lines to be replaced with /n. So that's what I'm going to do. Now it's all on one line. You can see the new lines have been replaced with /n. I'm going to copy this public key. And now we can actually start making our schema. Let me move this back here. So now we can go down here. We can go Dgraph.authorization. So this comment is needed to set up your authorization. And make sure you have a space between the hashtag and Dgraph authorization. It may cause problems otherwise. So we're going to add our verification key, which is the key that we just got. We're also going to add our algorithm, which is RS256. This is what Auth0 uses. Now we have a couple of choices to make. So our header, I'm just going to use X auth token. You can feel free to use anything you want. And for my namespace, this is also flexible. You can use whatever you want. I'm going to use https dgraph.io/jwt/claims. This is a pretty standard namespace, right? Then the last thing we need is the audience. So we're going to need to go back to Auth0, scroll up, and grab the client ID. This is going to be our audience for the token. So one thing to note is you can pass in multiple audiences. We're going to only use one. So, but what that means is it needs to be wrapped in an array. Okay. So let's update the schema, and you can see that that worked. All right. And let's do the next step and add the auth directive. So I'm just going to copy this because it's a lot of typing, but this is included in the repo. So again, we're adding a rule on query, and we're telling it only pull the to-dos that have a user with a username equal to the user that I've passed in. So let's update the schema now. Let's refresh our to-do app. And you can see that we can't see anything anymore. Well, this is because we don't have a JWT, right? We're not authorized to see any of these to-dos. So the next step will be to actually start integrating this with our React frontend, integrating Auth0 with our React frontend. And this is simple as well. So what we're going to need to do, and we already have this imported, but you're going to need to import the Auth0/Auth0 React package if you're using React, similar packages for other front-end frameworks. And what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to pull two things from Auth0. We're going to need to pull the Auth0 provider, right? And we're going to wrap our whole program in this. And we're going to need a couple of data points from Auth0. So we're going to need the domain, and we're going to need the client ID. So let's copy those. And there's one more thing we want to do. Redirect URI pretty much just tells it that after we sign in, please redirect to the place that you were before. And we're going to wrap our whole program in the Auth0 provider. All right, so the next step is we're using the Apollo client for our GraphQL queries. And as I said before, we need to actually pass in this JWT somehow. So we're going to actually edit the Apollo provider a bit. And we're going to force it to pass in the JWT as the XAuth token. All right, so what we'll need for this is we will need to import two things from the use Auth0 hook. All right. Oops. All right, so we're going to need the is authenticated. And is authenticated is pretty much, are you logged in or not, right? And then the second thing we're going to need is the get ID token claims. And we're going to use this to actually pull the full ID token. So first of all, what we're going to do is we are going to check if we're not authenticated, just return the regular headers. We don't need to modify them. But if you are authenticated, we need to pull the token. So we're going to await this get ID token claims. And then we're going to check, is this actually a token? If it is, we'll include the whole token. We don't need the claims. We just need the raw token. Otherwise, just pass in an empty string. We don't have a token to pass in. Okay. So generally, this is working, but there is a couple of things missing. So if we refresh the to-do page, you'll see nothing's changed. Why is that? That's because we haven't actually logged in, right? We need to force the user to actually log in via Auth0 somehow. So what we're going to do is we are going to import the use Auth0 hook here too. we're going to pull a couple of things from this. So we're going to pull the user is authenticated again, because we don't want to show the login button if they're not, or if they're already logged in, right? We also want to, we'll also want to pull in the login and logout methods. Okay, so this is all we're going to need. And then the next step is just to create a login and logout button. So I'm going to copy this because this is a bunch of, going to take a bunch of typing. But the overall thing is pretty much we have something we're rendering here based on if is authenticated is true or false. If it's false, we're rendering a login button or a login link. And if it's true, then we're rendering a logout link. All right. And then let's go ahead and add this under. Spelled that wrong. All right, now you can see that we have a login to use the app. We can click on it, and you see there's an error. So the reason is we haven't actually provided, so Auth0 has a lot of security, right? What we need to do is we actually need to provide the URL that we're running this program on. And for me, this is localhost 3000 because I'm running a local React app. But this can be anything for you. You just go into the app settings, same app settings that we've been looking at all day. And you put this URL in these 4 boxes. Okay? And then make sure to save those changes. Refresh. I guess go back to localhost. And then let's try logging in again. So what are we doing wrong here? Let me check if we put these correctly. So we put domain. Oh, so I picked the wrong domain. All right. All we'll need to do is go back to localhost, and now login should be working. Perfect. And we have login now. I'm going to sign in with my Google account. And you can see that now it actually shows my email. All right. We're able to get the login information from Auth0. So there is one last thing we need to do. So we're able to log in with Auth0. All of that is fine and dandy, but we need to actually add our custom claims into our token. Auth0 doesn't know how to do that out of the box. But there's a very simple solution for that. So let's go to rules. Let's create a new rule. And it can be an empty rule. And all we're going to do is we're pretty much, this is a very simple function, and this is also included in the repo. So we're actually going to inject in the ID token. This is our namespace, same one that we're using in our schema. So in the namespace, we're going to create an object. We're going to put the capital user, and that's just going to be the email that we logged in with. Very straightforward. All right, so now let's try this out. So obviously we can't see anything because none of the to-dos that we've created actually have our username. So let's try creating a new to-do, and this doesn't show up. Why is that? It's very simple. We haven't actually added our user to our to-do. So if you look at the add new to-dos, we just create a to-do with a value and the completed is false. We need to actually add a user. So we'll go user, username, and then we'll just go user.email. And this is the same user that we're importing using the Auth0 hook, right? All right. And by the way, Dgraph is smart enough to know that if this user already exists, not to create him again, just to assign this to do to that user, as I'll show you right now. So let's try doing some more to-dos. So I wanted to get my groceries. User username. User.email. Oh, it's because I didn't log in. So let me log in again. And this is one of the downsides of using Auth0 in the local host. Every time you run the program, you have to log in again. But okay, so I want to get my groceries, right? And I want to, for example, cook dinner. So now you can see that only I can see these. I don't see the rest of the tasks that we've inserted inside. And if I even refresh, I can't see them anymore because I'm not logged in. So adding authentication and authorization to our GraphQL app was honestly that simple. Thank you guys for watching. We're actually going to start the Q&A session now. Oh, and you noticed that the domain was not copied. Okay, thank you. I wish I had seen that sooner. All right, so let me open up the Q&A. So can you run it on your own Dgraph infra? Yeah, this works on any Dgraph deployment. Even if you want to run Dgraph locally and play around with it, works fine. All right. So I've answered. And then is auth. Oh, it's completely open source actually. So there's no enterprise needed, both locally and online on Slash, completely free. You want to use auth, you can get started with it right now. No money down. Okay, so hopefully that answers both of the, and yeah, I think that's all the questions have been answered. Is there any other questions? How to maintain a copy of the user instance in our, so that's a trickier question. And this depends a lot on how you plan to structure your program. There's two main flows that we've seen using this ourselves. So number one is that you don't maintain a user instance at all and use the Auth0 ID. So Auth0 gives you a unique user ID for each user, and then you use that as like a reference if you want to do that. So then you would never have the user object in your database. The other option is, oh, fair enough, actually. Let me read the, yeah, my pleasure, Mark. So how to maintain a copy of the user instance in our dgraph.io database or any database from Auth0. I'm just reading this out loud in case other people can't see this, and for the recording as well. So like I said, there's two approaches. The first one is that you don't maintain the user at all, and you just maintain a reference using the user ID. And we've seen people do that. It works fine. The only problem is every time you need to pull a user, you need to pull it from Auth0. So it has its downsides, but you don't have to keep two objects in sync. The other option is you have a user object and you keep some of the user details in Auth0. And the other details that you need in your database, you do the same thing. You have a reference to the ID and you link to that. Hopefully that answers your question. I don't think there's a one size fits all to that question, but hopefully that can give you a couple of ideas of how we've seen it doing. So is the auth query the same on Dgraph GraphQL? Yeah. So it is just a regular query actually. So I have it open right here. You can see it's just query to do, and you can pass in anything. So that's how flexible it really is. It's just a regular query. How do we get the roles from Auth0 onto our DB for RBAC? So there's a couple of ways to do this again. I wouldn't even put it in your database. I would, because Auth0 has RBAC roles and stuff, right? You can just inject it into the same way that we injected the email. You can inject the role into the JWT, right? And then based on that, and here I can show you an example. Let's go to authorization. And then you can literally just role match. So for example, only admins are allowed to delete. So hopefully that answers your question. I would just include it in the JWT. All right, let me go back to the. All right, any more questions? So I'm just gonna answer the last question here. So I've answered Grav's question. Yes, it is just a regular query. You can use any filter that you use normally. And so we define the business rules in the interface, control what a user sees and what data they can touch. There are other factors such as workflow that determine if somebody can see data, any best practices. So that's obviously a complex question. And this really depends on how exactly your app is working. But there is other ways. For example, let's say somebody needs to complete a specific step to be able to see specific rules, okay? So let's say I have to verify my email before I can start entering to-dos. You can actually add attributes into the Auth0 object and then inject them into the JWT. That's one option. Or you can have Auth0 actually query maybe even Dgraph or some sort of database, some sort of server, and then inject those into the JWT and send that off to Dgraph. So it's very flexible. The only limitation is really, can you insert it into the JWT? So hopefully that answers your question, Vish. Can we use dgraph.io on our own server, like Node and Express? So hopefully I understand this question correctly, but you can host Dgraph wherever you want, okay? You can download it. It's an open source project. You can host it and you can use it. And if you want to put a Node server in front of that, yeah, no problem. And if you want to use the Node server as the authentication service, yeah, no problem. You install Passport. It'll give you, I think, pretty much a working JWT out of the box. You'll need to inject the claims, obviously. But other than that, you have a working authentication service. Otherwise, if you're talking about some sort of API server that you can put on top of it, yeah, no problem. You can do that as well. Is there a Julia connector to Dgraph? Honestly, I have no clue. I'll have to get back to you on that. If you want to send us your email or leave a question and discuss, we can get back to you about that. I don't know. Best way to store JWT, cookies or local storage? From what I know, local storage or cookies are more secure because you can have, for example, session only. But I'm not an expert in this, but I do think cookies are the way to go. Local storage is obviously more flexible, and you have the session storage as well. Yeah. Hopefully that answers your question. All right, so this is the final call for questions. If you don't ask a question now, then that's it. All right, guys, the final countdown. So if you don't ask now, you might regret it for the rest of your life. So we have 10 more seconds. If anybody asks a question then, we'll get to it. If not, we're just gonna wrap up this webinar. How good? Well, it's good. I think you're not gonna comparatively with Mongo. Okay, so Rajat is asking how good is Dgraph.io as a database service? So I don't know if I can give an unbiased answer to this question, obviously, but I think it's far better than Mongo. I like Mongo actually, so this isn't coming from like a derogatory, but Mongo, as I'm sure you know, struggles with relationships, and you just have to do lots of strange workarounds to get things to work as they should, right? Versus Dgraph is a graph database, and in my opinion, handles relationships better than even SQL databases, which are already fantastic at dealing with relationships, right? So I would recommend it over Mongo for sure. Oh, all right. Well, I appreciate you asking the question. So Vish is asking, any comments on JWT signatures, symmetrical or asymmetrical? Asymmetrical is better. You can use both in Dgraph. Oh, oops. You can use both in Dgraph. And for reference, what asymmetrical and symmetrical means is the kind of key that you're using. So a symmetrical key means that the same key is used on the front end and the server, and the asymmetrical is the public and private key model. Well, all right. Thank you guys for your questions, and thank you guys for attending. We really appreciate it. I hope you guys learned a lot from this. And if you have any questions, any follow-up, my pleasure, Vish. So if you guys have any questions, any follow-up, like for example, you would want to try it out yourself and you run into a problem, you want to learn how to do something a bit more advanced, feel free to message us on our Discuss. We're more than happy to answer your questions. Thank you, Niraj. All right, so we're going to wrap it up. Again, thank you guys for attending. We really appreciate it. We're going to be sending you guys an email with the recording of this video, a GitHub repo that has everything, including the final product. So it has the boilerplate if you want to start and follow along with the video. And it has the final product if you just want to take a look at how it's done. It also has a bunch of resources for people who don't know what JWTs are, for example. Maybe you want a better introduction to GraphQL schema. All of that is linked in the GitHub repo. And we're also going to, as I'm sure has been posted in the chat, we're also going to be doing a raffle. You guys might win a special prize. So again, thank you guys. And we hope to see you guys in the next webinar.